Now that we have bone structures and limbs that have moved underneath our organism, we can actually make a movement onto land. So the first movement between lobe-finned fish and our amphibians is this development of an organism with waterproof sort of characteristics. Our amphibians still have to stay in moist environments, and the reason for this is because they breathe through their skin. So if they don't stay in that moist environment, they actually can't breathe. They suffocate. The other thing is they have fully aquatic embryos and larvae, meaning that they lay their eggs in the water, so they have to stay close to these wet environments, particularly for reproduction. So think about amphibians kind of like mosses of the plant world, right? We look at this slow transition. There are particular adaptations, including an ability to deal with water loss a little bit, and this idea that the reproduction is still very, very water dependent. So this is going to include our salamanders and frogs and so on. And when we look at the early development of these organisms, they still, as we said, have to maintain kind of that close proximity to water, and they have to keep that moist skin so that they can breathe. In our amphibian life cycle, we do see some terrestrial frogs that can move further away from these ponds and wet environments, but we still see all of them have to return to at least some sort of temporary pool or small pond in the reproductive season to actually reproduce, because our frogs and salamanders and so on are dependent on the water for these early developmental stages of the offspring. So how do we get away from this? How do we get them to move away from the water? How did we get plants to move away from the water? Well, we gave them vascular tissue, right? Well, okay. Animals can deal with water as long as they have some available to drink. What was the other thing? We gave plants seeds, right? So they could stop depending on water for reproduction. That was the big thing. So, what can we give to our animals to get them away from the water for reproduction? An amniotic egg. So to move from our amphibians to our reptiles and mammals, we're going to give them an amniotic egg. This amniotic egg is critical. It actually is going to keep the eggs from drying out. And when we look at reptiles, there are three main ones that use this amniotic egg: turtles, lizards, and crocodiles. But we also look at mammals then eventually as having an amniotic-like egg as well. So reptiles, birds, all of our mammals fall into this amniote category, and it has 4 major structures associated with it. I don't expect you to remember all of these structures, but I do want you to look at the similarity between this amniotic egg and what we saw as a seed in plants, right? So there's a shell around the outside, much like our seed coat. There's the embryo inside, of course, developing, and then there's a yolk sac. Well, in our plants, we called this yolk sac endosperm, but in animals, we call it a yolk. So that's where all the nutrients are that are going to protect or feed our developing offspring while it's protected inside this shell until it's actually able to hatch out. So as far as reptiles go, they have some interesting characteristics. They are now essentially waterproof, so they are not dependent on the water for keeping their skin moist. They don't have to breathe through their skin anymore. Most often they're using lungs. But the weird thing about reptiles is they are what we call an ectotherm. Ecto is outside, right? So their body temperature is dependent on the outside environment. They are what we call a cold-blooded organism, meaning that if it's cold outside, they're cold. If it's warm outside, they're warm. Well, the deal here is that they actually don't generate much of their own body heat. So they're dependent on the environment to maintain their body temperature. This can, of course, be problematic. right? If you've ever seen a snake in the woods in the summertime, in the early morning when it's still cold, that snake will not be moving around very much. But in the afternoon, once he heats up, it's a whole different story, right? So this transition from dinosaurs to birds, we've talked about before with Archaeopteryx. So I don't want to go into that in a whole lot of detail now, but just to remind you that this is our link between our reptiles and our birds based on bone similarities and structures that we've seen in the development of feathers and so on. And we think that birds actually came from a very distinct lineage of dinosaurs known as theropods. They are two-legged dinosaurs, different than we typically think of with a triceratops or something like that, right? So this bone structure we've looked at before, so this link between reptiles and birds. Most birds we know can fly. There are exceptions today. There are some large birds that don't fly. There are also some birds such as the kiwi that have gone through a reversal and lost their wings, so they are ground bound now. They don't fly anymore. But flight evolutionarily here, of course, very important to increase dispersal. It is, however, though, very, very costly. Right? Think about all of the energy that a bird is going to have to put into flying. So birds are endothermic, so endo is inside, so they are regulating their own body temperature. Unlike our reptiles. And we do see more complex behaviors starting to develop in these birds. Things like migrations, right? Sexual selection types of behaviors, all kinds of things going on. So here's a sky point of an albatross, very common mating or courtship display, and this idea of this just complete removal from need of water for reproduction and so on. Now birds, of course, still need water. Many of them, of course, use the water to find fish and so on. But what we look at is this new independence from not only the water, but now also from the ground to some degree.